World War II dramatically changed the United States from an isolationist country into a military superpower and leader in world affairs. After the war, most of the Americans at home and the millions coming back from military service wished to return to normal domestic life and enjoy the revitalized national economy. However, during the Truman presidency, the growing conflict between the communist Soviet Union and the United States, a conflict that came to be known as the Cold War, dampened the nation's enjoyment of the post-war boom. Let's see how we got to this point. Every group in the U.S. population adjusted to the unique circumstances of wartime. The increase of factory jobs caused millions to leave rural areas for industrial jobs in the Midwest and on the Pacific Coast, especially California. Entirely new communities arose around the construction of new factories and military bases. Many of the new defense installations were located in the South because of the region's warm climate and low labor costs. The wartime expansion set the stage for a post-war migration to the Sun Belt. Attracted by jobs in the North and West, over 1.5 million African Americans left the South. In addition, 1 million young men left home to serve in the armed forces. Whether as soldiers or civilians, all faced continued discrimination and segregation. White resentment in urban areas led to dozens dying in race riots in New York and Detroit during the summer of 1943. Civil rights leaders encouraged African Americans to adopt the double V slogan, one for victory over fascism abroad and one for equality at home. Membership in the NAACP increased during the war. Another civil rights organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, was formed in 1942 to work more militantly for African American interests. After Black leaders threatened to protest the March on Washington, the Roosevelt administration issued an executive order to prohibit discrimination in government and in business that received federal contracts. One judicial victory was achieved in the Supreme Court case of Smith versus Allwright in 1944, which ruled that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans as a way of excluding them from voting in primaries. Mexican Americans worked in defense industries and over 300,000 served in the military. A 1942 agreement with Mexico allowed Mexican farm workers known as barristeros to enter the United States in the harvest season without going through former immigration procedures. The sudden influx of Mexican immigrants into Los Angeles stirred white resentment and led to the so-called Zoot Suit riots in the summer of 1943, in which whites and Mexican Americans battled on the streets. American Indians also contributed to the war effort. Approximately 25,000 served in the military and thousands more worked in defense industries. Having discovered the opportunities off their reservations, more than half never returned. More than any other ethnic group, Japanese Americans suffered from their association with a wartime enemy. Almost 20,000 native-born Japanese Americans served loyally in the military. Nevertheless, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were suspected of being potential spies and saboteurs, and a Japanese invasion of the West Coast was considered imminent by many. In 1942, these irrational fears, as well as racism, prompted the U.S. government to order over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to leave their homes and reside in the barracks of internment camps. Japanese Americans living in other parts of the U.S., including Hawaii, did not come under this order. In the case of Korematsu versus the U.S. in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the U.S. government's internment policy as justified in wartime. Years later, in 1988, the federal government agreed the ruling was unjust and awarded financial compensation to those still alive who had been interned. The war also changed the lives of women. Over 200,000 women served in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Marines, but in non-combat roles. As in World War I, an acute labor shortage caused women to take jobs vacated by men in uniform. Almost 5 million women entered the workforce, many of them working in industrial jobs in the shipyards and defense plants. The number of married women in the workforce increased by 24%. A song about Rosie the Riveter was used to encourage women to take defense jobs. However, they received pay well below the male factory workers. The New Deal helped immigrant groups feel more included, and serving together as bands of brothers in combat or working together for a common cause in defense plants helped to reduce prejudice based on nationality, ethnicity, and religion. The wartime migrations also helped to soften regional differences and open the eyes of many Americans to the injustice of racial discrimination. In February of 1945, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, conferred again at Yalta, a resort town on the Black Sea coast of the Soviet Union. Their agreement at Yalta would prove the most historic of the three meetings. After victory in Europe was achieved, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed that 1. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. 2. There would be free elections in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe. 3. The Soviets would enter the war against Japan, which they did on August 8, 1945, just as Japan was about to surrender. 4. The Soviets would control certain islands in the Pacific and would have special concessions in Manchuria. And lastly, a new world peace organization, known to us today as the United Nations, would be formed at a conference in San Francisco. When the president returned from Yalta and informed Congress of his agreement with Churchill and Stalin, it was apparent that his health had deteriorated. On April 12, 1945, while resting in a vacation home in Georgia, an exhausted Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly. News of his death shocked the nation almost as much as Pearl Harbor. Harry S. Truman entered the presidency unexpectedly to assume enormous responsibilities as commander-in-chief of a war effort that had not yet been won. In late July, after Germany's surrender, only Stalin remained as one of the Big Three. Truman was the U.S. president, and Clement Attlee had just been elected the new British Prime Minister. The three leaders met in Potsdam, Germany from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, and agreed on two things. 1. To demand that Japan surrender unconditionally, and 2. To hold war crime trials of Nazi leaders. Unlike the rejection of the League of Nations following World War I, Congress readily accepted the peacekeeping organization that was conceived during World War II and put in place immediately after the war. Meeting in 1944 near Washington, D.C., Allied representatives of the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China proposed an international organization to be called the United Nations. Then in April 1945, delegates from 50 nations assembled in San Francisco, where they took only 8 weeks to draft a charter for the United Nations. The Senate quickly voted to accept U.S. involvement in the UN. On October 24, 1945, the UN came into existence when the majority of member nations ratified its charter. The Cold War dominated international relations from the late 1940s to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The conflict centered around the intense rivalry between two superpowers, the Communist Empire of the Soviet Union and the leading Western democracy, the United States. Superpower competition usually was through diplomacy rather than armed conflict, but in several instances, the Cold War took the world dangerously close to a nuclear war. Among historians, there is an intense debate over how and why the Cold War began. Many analysts see Truman's policies as a reasonable response to Soviet efforts to increase their influence in the world. However, some critics argue that Truman misunderstood and overreacted to Russia's historic need to secure its borders. Other critics have attacked his administration as being weak or soft on communism. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union against the Axis powers was actually a temporary halt in their generally poor relations of the past. Since the Bolshevik Revolution that established a communist government in Russia in 1917, Americans had viewed the Soviets as a threat to all capitalistic countries. In the United States, it led to the Red Scare of 1919. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. Even then, after a brief honeymoon period of less than a year, Roosevelt's advisors concluded that Joseph Stalin and the communists could not be trusted. Confirming their view was the notorious Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, in which Stalin and Hitler agreed to divide up Eastern Europe. In 1941, Hitler's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union and Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor led to a US-Soviet alliance of convenience, but not of mutual trust. Stalin bitterly complained that the British and Americans waited until 1944 to open a second front in France. Because of this wait, the Soviets bore the brunt of fighting the Nazis. By some estimates, half of all deaths of World War II were Soviets. The post-war conflicts over Central and Eastern Europe were already evident in the negotiations between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the US at Yalta and Potsdam in 1945. Roosevelt hoped that personal diplomacy might keep Stalin in check, but when Truman came to power, he quickly became suspicious of the Soviets. The founding of the United Nations in the fall of 1945 provided one hopeful sign for the future. The General Assembly of the United Nations was created to provide representation to all member nations, while the 15-member Security Council was given the primary responsibility within the UN for maintaining international security and authorizing peacekeeping missions. The 5 major allies of wartime, the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, were granted permanent seats and veto power in the UN Security Council. Optimists hoped that these nations would be able to reach agreement on international issues. In addition, the Soviets went along with a U.S. proposal to establish an Atomic Energy Commission in the United Nations. They rejected, however, a plan proposed by Bernard Baruch for regulating nuclear energy and eliminating atomic weapons. Rejection of the Baruch plan was interpreted by some American leaders as proof that Moscow did not have peaceful intentions. The United States also offered the Soviets participation in the new International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, also known as the World Bank, created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The bank's initial purpose was to fund rebuilding of a war-torn world. The Soviets, however, declined to participate because they viewed the bank as an instrument of capitalism. The Soviets did join the other allies in the 1945-1946 Nuremberg trials of 22 top Nazi leaders for war crimes and violations of human rights. Distrust turned into hostility beginning in 1946 as Soviet forces remained in occupation of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Elections were held by the Soviets, as promised by Stalin at Yalta, but the results were manipulated in favor of communist candidates. One by one, from 1946 to 1948, communist dictators, most of them loyal to Moscow, came to power in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Sympathizers for the Soviets argued that Russia needed buffer states or satellites, or nations under the control of a great power, as a protection against another Hitler-like invasion from the West. The US and British governments were alarmed by the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. They regarded Soviet actions in this region as a flagrant violation of self-determination, genuine democracy, and open markets. The British especially wanted free elections in Poland, whose independence had been the issue that started World War II. At the end of the war, the division of Germany and Austria into Soviet, French, British, and US zones of occupation was meant to be only temporary. In Germany, however, the Eastern Zone under Soviet occupation gradually evolved into a new communist state, the German Democratic Republic. The conflict over Germany was at least in part a conflict over differing views of national security and economic needs. The Soviets wanted a weak Germany for security reasons and large war reparations for economic reasons. The United States and Great Britain refused to allow reparations from their western zones because both viewed the economic recovery of Germany as important to the stability of Central Europe. The Soviets, fearing a restored Germany, tightened their control over East Germany. Also, since Berlin lay within their zone, they attempted to force the Americans, British, and French to give up their assigned sectors of the city. News of a Canadian spy ring stealing atomic secrets for the Soviets and continued Soviet occupation of northern Iran further encouraged a get tough policy in Washington. In March of 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, Truman was present on the Speaker's platform as former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared an Iron Curtain was descended across the continent of Europe. The Iron Curtain metaphor was later used throughout the Cold War to refer to the Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech called for a partnership between Western democracies to halt the expansion of communism. Did the speech anticipate the Cold War or help to cause it? Historians still debate this question.